In the spirit of reconciliation, the Greek community of Melbourne acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past, present, emerging, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Good evening, Kalispera sas. Welcome to our 6th seminar of 2023 in the Greek community's Public History and Culture Seminar Series. As I mentioned in the initial seminar this year, the seminars in 2023 will be almost equally split between face-to-face delivery at the mezzanine level of the Greek Centre when we have local or interstate speakers, and online delivery when we have international guests. There will be no hybrid seminars, but we will be posting the presentation online after the event when we have permission from the presenters. Our next two seminars will be online with international speakers, as we've lost access to the mezzanine level as it's one of the core venues of the Comedy Festival. Please look up the program. Our next seminar at the mezzanine will be on the 27th of April, where Dr. Effie Steriopoulos will give the Anzac Day Memorial Lecture. Next week is Greek Easter, so we won't be having a seminar on our regular Thursday evening, but we will be having a seminar next Tuesday evening. Yes, Tuesday evening, and we have one of Greece's leading historians, Professor Maria Efthimiou, delivering it. It will be delivered in Greek, and the topic covered is Enduring the Test of Time, the highlights of Hellenism in the 3,500 years of its recorded history. With respect to tonight's seminar, we'd like to thank Joseph Tsalanidis and the Ancient Oplikon of Melbourne for their seminar sponsorship, and we invite you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice during the course of the year. We are indeed extremely grateful and honoured to have with us again this year Professor Paul Cartledge, a world-renowned classicist and probably the world's leading authority on Sparta and anything Spartan. To introduce Professor Cartledge, we are equally honoured to have with us Miltiadis Paikopoulos, someone of Spartan heritage, someone whose undergraduate studies were in the classics, and until recently, the former president of the Peloponnesian Brotherhood of Melbourne. And we also like to thank the Brotherhood for promoting this event as well. Miltiadi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nick. And as was said, I'm Miltiadis Paikopoulos, and it's my pleasure and great honour tonight to have been asked to introduce Professor Paul Cartledge as part of the GOCMB's Greek History and Culture Seminar Series for 2023. I'd like to thank Dr. Nick Dallas again for not only the opportunity, but all the hard work he's done for this project. It was almost 4 years ago that as an undergraduate passionate about classical and Spartan studies that I first came into communication with the professor, a giant in the field, who has been a wellspring of support and advice ever since. For that, I am and always will be most grateful. Professor Cartledge is the A.G. Leventis Senior Research Fellow of Clare College and formerly the inaugural A.G. Leventis Professor of Greek Culture at the University of Cambridge. He's authored, co-authored, and edited 30 books, including most recently Democracy, a Life, and Thebes, the Forgotten City of Ancient Greece. His field of study is Athens and Sparta in the Classical Age, and he has been described as a Laconophile, a lover of Sparta. He was also the chief historical consultant for the BBC TV series The Greeks and the Channel 4 series The Spartans, presented by Bettany Hughes. Professor Cartledge is also an honorary citizen of modern Sparta and has recently been awarded the Commander of the Order of Honor for his contribution to enhancing Greece's stature abroad. Tonight's presentation is based on Professor Cartledge's book, Hellenistic and Roman Sparta, A Tale of Two Cities, first published in 1989, but revised in 2002, which directs readers to the importance of post-classical Sparta. He makes a distinction between Hellenistic Sparta, roughly the last 3 centuries BC, and Roman Sparta, pointing out that they were different enough to be best understood as two distinct entities. Hellenistic Sparta saw the end of the old classical Sparta with its distinctive Helot, Spartiate, and Perioeci-based social, political, and economic regime, Roman Sparta had almost become a normal Greek city, but came to rely on its glorious past in order to attract visiting tourists. I'd now like to invite Professor Cartledge to begin his seminar, Hellenistic and Roman Sparta, A Tale of Two Cities. Let's all welcome him.
Good day, Kalimerisas. Hello to the Greek community of Melbourne. I'd like to start by votes of thanks to especially Nick Dallas, for, as Miltiades said, organizing. What an amazing program. I've looked through the entire program for your year, and it really is most impressive. And then I'd like to thank our technician, who has had more than usual problems, I think, with me, and that's Kostas Avlonidis. And finally, but not least, to Miltiades Paikopoulos for his very generous introduction. And may I return the compliment. It's been a pleasure communicating with you and finally seeing you in person today on screen. Thanks to your donors and sponsors, without whom this would not be possible. And I'd like finally to dedicate this talk, a short talk, some 40 minutes or so, I hope, to the memory of my dear friend, a really great Sparta scholar, Anton Powell, who sadly died quite recently, far too young. And to my very much alive, I would also like to co-dedicate it to my very much alive friend and former collaborator, Tony Sporforth, who really is the expert, not I, on Roman Sparta. So for once, perhaps, I'm not quite as expert on every aspect of what I'm going to be talking to you about as I would normally hope and expect to be. There is a handout available, which you will have seen on Facebook and other outlets. Now, why a handout? Because the slideshow that I'm going to start from will have just 3 slides, and it will just be orientation. And the actual meat of my talk will be related to the handout. So if you want to follow visually, you'll need to download and access that handout. So just to repeat what Miltiades very elegantly said, the baseline of this talk is a book that I and Tony wrote on the basis of inspection of Laconia. We hired a car, we went round for a couple of weeks. 1980s, and the book's first edition came out with Routledge in a series of cities of ancient Greece in 1989, and it was a sequel to my first Sparta book, which was published 10 years before, 1979, and that was my doctoral thesis book, as it were. So the idea of such a talk as today is to revisit, where possible, revise, enhance the main. I can't in 40 minutes do anything like justice to the entirety of Hellenistic and Roman Sparta, the main lines of Hellenistic and Roman Spartan history, between, in broad outline figures, circa 300 BC or BCE and circa 400 AD or CE. And in summary, we summarized and we added as a subtitle, A Tale of Two Cities, of course, borrowing from Dickens. But the point was that Sparta, ancient Sparta, wasn't just one thing. It was at least 3 separate political entities. One, which is probably the most famous one, which is what we'll classical, and its predecessor, archaic Sparta, so circa 700 BC to 300 BC, something like that, whereby Sparta developed its power in the Peloponnese. And if I could have the first slide, Kostas, please. You'll see there a picture of the Aegean area. And so we're talking about Sparta as situated on the river Evrodas in southern eastern Peloponnesos, the island of Pelops. And if I could then move on to the next slide, Kostas, the Peloponnese. The point of this is to show you Sparta geopolitically at its absolute maximum. Before, what I'm going to be talking about is the gradual progressive reduction in the scope, the sphere, the geopolitical reach of Sparta. So the area shaded in yellow at the bottom, almost half of the Peloponnese, was the territory of the polis of Sparta between, as I say, circa 700 BCE and circa 300 going down into the 2nd century BC. As the Hellenistic period develops, so Sparta becomes progressively reduced until it is finally concentrated, just like any, as it were, Greek city, to its central place and its immediately surrounding territory, what we call the Spartan plain, at the northern part of the Evrotas Valley. Now, I've already said something slightly controversial because there is a debate about just how normal, or on the other hand, odd, classical Sparta was. I'm one of those who think that it was very much on the side of the abnormal, atypical, and that partly explains why it was so powerful. It was able to perform the things that it did, and some of them were not particularly nice. And so I've banged on about how I believe the basis of ancient Sparta's power were those Greeks, native Greeks, collectively known as Helots, which means captives, who lived either on the west in Messina or on the east in Laconia. Laconia, by the way, is a Roman term. The ancient term for totality of Sparta's territory was Lacedaemon, which also was the name of the city, the actual town where the Spartans lived. The Spartans did not live on their land, the land that they held. They lived in Sparta, and the land that they owned was worked by Helots. So, as I say, what we see in the Hellenistic, and then more particularly in it, is the normalization of, and in my opinion, really quite odd state of the 7th, 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries BC. To summarize, Hellenistic Sparta is normalized in a number of different ways. The dual kingship, which was hereditary in 2 separate aristocratic families, both claiming descent from ultimately Heracles and therefore ultimately from Zeus. This is myth history, of course, rather than genealogical, genetic history. That comes to an end towards the end of the 3rd century BC, put on my handout, circa 230. And then there is a sort of attempt to replace the dual kingship with a sole kingship. This is what would normally be called a tyranny, exercised by a man called Nabis or Nabis, whose dad's name was Darmaritos, which some of you will instantly recognize as the name of a 6th, 5th century Spartan king. And Nabis indeed claimed descent from that family. So there's a certain sense in which Sparta into the 2nd century still has some links to that ancient form of rule. But socio-culturally, as I put it, that is in terms of education, preparation for war, that pretty comes to an end during the first half of the 2nd century BC. And economically speaking, as I've said, in my opinion, Helotage, the system of exploiting, of oppressing Greeks, enslaving them and making them work to do the labor of production, that came to an end by the end of the Hellenistic period, by the time the Roman Empire comes into being under the first emperor Augustus. And that takes us on to, I'm still summarizing what I'm going to be saying in a little more detail. In about 30 BC, BCE, Augustus bestrode the entirety of the Roman Empire, which of course is a huge expanse, and its eastern half was fundamentally Greek-speaking. And this is where we are talking about, we're looking at Sparta within the Roman Empire, where the notion of an independent Greece doesn't exist. The notion of an independent city-state, such as Sparta had been, as many hundreds of independent cities, that's all gone. We're talking about an impression, so if you like, somewhat analogous to the Ottoman domination of Greece, the Turkocratia. And then I shall move on to look at those two cities in some detail. So you no longer need to look at the map, but if you wish, Kostas wishes to keep it on. But I do recommend, if you have access to my handout, you may find that of use to you. So just to get going, before we enter what we call the Hellenistic period, which broadly speaking is the reign of Alexander the Great, so 336 to 323, then shades into post-Alexander, Hellenistic, Greek-ish culture expands all the way to Afghanistan, Pakistan. This is a new Greek world, a world of territorial monarchies. And the one that mattered for Greeks, including Spartans, was the Antigonid monarchy based up in Macedon in Pella. But before I move into the post-Alexander period, I want just to mention one particular item of information. And this is a text which Alexander, he's set off into the Persian Empire. He's in what we call Western Turkey. He wins his first battle at the river Granikos. And the Spartans had resisted his dad, Philip. They had never signed up to join the great Pan-Hellenic expedition against the Persian Empire. So Alexander rather contemptuously sends a message back to Athens, making the point, so what? Who needs the Spartans now? And the point of that is to look back at 150 years of Greek history, resisting the Persians, the Spartans and the Athenians. This is Leonidas, and continuing on in terms of Sparta's claim to be the greatest Greek city, defending and championing and expanding Hellenism. And now look at it in 334 BC, a shadow, its former self, mainly because of Thebes. And as Miltiades says, that's my most recent book, actually, was on Thebes. There's a great battle at Leuctra in Viotia in Boeotia, which the Thebans, led by Epaminondas, won absolutely swingingly. The Spartans lost many men, and they lost their place as leader of a great alliance, what we call the Peloponnesian League. They then lose half their territory because the Messenian Helots revolt, and there is a third force or a third group of people within the great Spartan state, southern Peloponnese. They're called Perioeci, or dwellers round about. So the Spartans lose the Messenian Perioeci, and then progressively they're going to lose all the remaining Perioeci and all the remaining Helots. Alexander's message was, Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks, except the Spartans, dedicate, and then what he sent back was 300 panoplies, that is a breastplate, a helmet, symbolizing the hoplites, the heavy infantry, of which once upon a time the Spartans were the absolutely greatest exemplars. But now they're a thing of the past, a shadow of their former self. So let's move into Hellenistic as such. And I'm starting on the handout by citing for you an essay in an absolutely terrific collection. It's a 2-volume edition edited by my late friend Anton Powell. It's called A Companion to Sparta, 2017 to 2018, available at least some of it online. And this is the essay by Daniel Stewart, and it's entitled From Leuctra, that's the battle I mentioned, to Nabis, 371 BC to 192. I also mention on the handout very much more recent book by Joanna Crowley, who is the widow of Anton Powell, The Hellenistic Peloponnese. She is, of course, Greek, but this is written in English and published by the Classical Press of Wales. So Hellenism, Hellenistic period, circa 300 to circa 30 BC, roughly the last 3 centuries, BC, BCE. I'm inserting the reign of a man who represents the transition between classical and Hellenistic, so far as kingship is concerned. So the Spartan dual kingship continues on into the Hellenistic period, but a certain Arius, and he's Arius the First because there was an Arius later than him, he reigned from circa 309 to 265. He got involved in broader Greek politics, but in the shadow of the power of Macedon, which was the dominant power in mainland Greece. And he fancied himself as a kind of rival, a kind of equivalent to the new Macedonian monarchs who ruled in mainland Greece, in Egypt, the Ptolemies, or in Asia, Asia Minor, the Seleucids. And he did so by striking a coinage of silver. Now you might think Greeks had been striking coins for centuries. So, I mean, what's new? Well, this is the first ever Spartan coinage, silver coinage with a stamp. And of course, it's Heracles they choose to put as their emblem because he is the founding father, the founder of the 2 Spartan dynasties, ruling houses. And he claims to be just the sole king of Sparta. He has his name Vasilevs incised on his coin. So here is Sparta, a shadow of itself, but trying to join the big boys. Spartan king trying to suggest that he's on a par with the great Antigonids of Pella or the great Ptolemies of Alexandria in Egypt. I'm being selective, as I've said. I can't take you through year by year or even half century by half century. So I'm going to leap forward to the middle of the 3rd century BC. And we have a couple of sources. Historians are nothing without sources. I've mentioned coins. There's a certain amount of archaeological evidence, but our principal source is written texts, whether literary sources, whether narrative accounts, or epigraphic texts. And so there are 2 main sources for my next subject, which is where Sparta, rather paradoxically, enters center stage of ancient Greek history again in the middle of the 3rd century BC. So we're in the 240s, 230s, 220s, and through 2 kings. Agis IV, who belonged to the Eurypontid house, and Cleomenes III, who belonged to the Aegead house. The Aegead house was the notionally senior one because they traced their ancestry back to 2 twins, obviously 2 twins, but the elder twin was deemed to be the ancestor of the Aegead house, and the other twin born later was deemed to be the ancestor of the Eurypontid house. Anyway, that's not what matters. What matters is that Sparta, by the middle of the 3rd century BC, was in dire crisis. And our evidence for this is, on the one hand, a near contemporary, Polybius, from Megalopolis, a new foundation in the 4th century BC in Arcadia, a die-hard anti-Spartan, and Plutarch, writing much later, round about 100 AD, so we're, 2-3 centuries later, but nevertheless using contemporary sources, one of whom, a man called Philakos of Athens, Polybius really disliked, both for the manner of his history and for the content, because he was much too nice. So Polybius believed too, these two kings, Agis IV, Cleomenes III, who were not co-regnant, but they were sequential in a positive sense. In other words, Cleomenes completed what Agis had failed to carry through but had initiated. So Sparta was in crisis, socio-economic, a crisis of debt and depopulation. We're talking about only 700 Spartan citizens, 700, compared with 8,000 in 480 BC, 700. And of those 700, so Plutarch's source says, only 100 owned land. So this is quite extraordinary. Typically, to be a citizen, you have to have some sort of stake in the land ownership, the land owned collectively by the citizen body. It was in a state of military political crisis also, because by then, well, you can't do much if you've only got that number of citizens as available to fight. And so both kings, rather typically as it now seems, invoked a lawgiver by name Lycurgus we say in English, who may or may not have ever actually existed. And I put it that way because he probably did, but that the tradition about him was so enlarged, so enhanced, that the reality at base, I think, has been overwhelmed by the later accretions. At any rate, he was thought to be the great lawgiver of early Sparta, laying down the social, economic, political, cultural program which made Sparta great, and that is classical Sparta. So one way of refurbishing, tooling Sparta was back to Lycurgus. You know why we're not doing so well? Because we've abandoned the laws of Lycurgus, which when we followed them, we did brilliantly. We've successively failed to follow them, and so we must restore them. Actually, of course, what they were doing was innovating under the disguise of pretending to restore. And so they, for example, cancelled debts. Well, that's not great for the creditors, but it means that you can restart, you can reboot. They redefined citizenship, and now that's much more drastic. And one way of doing that was by incorporating people from the Perioecic communities as full citizens. Spartans had often used Perioeci, but they'd rigidly maintained the distinction. You're either born a Spartan or you're not a Spartan. You can't be made, you can't become a Spartan by adoption, with one or two individual exceptions. So that was one way. Another way was, and this is much more drastic, Cleomenes advertised, please, Helots, any of you who wish to become Spartans and to fight in the Spartan army, this is against the Macedonians, because Spartans are trying to release themselves from Spartan power to establish some sort of independence, as well as conduct internal reforms and extend their power, or extend some power in the Peloponnese. For all these reasons, they needed a much bigger army. Well, apparently 6,000 Helots had the amount of money, it wasn't a huge amount, but it wasn't insubstantial, that Cleomenes requested, you must pay, and that would go towards equipping them, not as hoplites, because now we're talking about new Macedonian style infantry fighting in phalanxes of people called sarissophoroi. So they're carrying extremely long lances. So Cleomenes, following the death, Agis was actually tried. His enemies, his conservative enemies, disliked having had their loans cancelled, for example. They had him tried and put to death. Cleomenes succeeds, he raises an army, and he's partly very, very successful. And in 223, and this explains why Polybius hated him so much. Polybius was born in the next generation at the end of the 3rd century. He physically destroyed this new city, I mean, relatively new, of Megalopolis. So Polybius of the restored, revived Megalopolis was not thrilled with Cleomenes III. Cleomenes also established major constitutional changes, and I'm going to come back to one of them when I look at Rome briefly. So one of these was to replace the old office of ephors, ephoroi, overseers. There used to be 5 annually selected by election. They were replaced by a board of 6 patronomoi, that's to say something to do with fathers, patres, and something to do with nomoi, so regulating the things of the fathers. It's an ancestral institution, of which there was an eponymous. So one of them, and these were all nominated, no longer elected, by the kings and by their advisors. However, despite this brief florescence, Spartan ambitions, Cleomenes' ambitions, were brought to an end in 222. Battle of Selazia, just north of Sparta. Antigonos III, Doson as he was known, he who will give, king of Macedon, came down from the north, defeated Cleomenes totally. Cleomenes was forced to flee, and he fled, interestingly, to Alexandria in Egypt. One of the archaeological pieces of evidence that we can draw upon to illustrate the nature of the change of Sparta's both self-perception and its outface towards the rest of the world is that during the 2nd century and 1st century BC, a serious city wall was for the first time ever built. Now, there'd been bits of walling as early as the late 4th century, but this is a proper wall, mud brick on stone circle. And the way it's been traced, and it was done by the British School at Athens at the beginning of the 20th century, and the article by Alan Wace is still worth reading. Wace became professor of classical at Cambridge. The way the wall was via tile stamp. Big, but it had one drawback, and one reason why they had only but one, namely it. Now, Amicla is about 5 kilometer cluster of Sparta, being equal to the other 4 of Sparta. So from this time onwards, Amicla is separated longer part of the town or city. I put on the handout an article Trump, Donald, and his attempts in the southern part of the United States. Not terribly successful, and it's with the Spartans' success at building. Another archaeological transition, it illustrates the to Roman Sparta is the building of, but Sparta had a theatre. Herodotus mentions it, but the theatre like built at the foot of the Acropolis, which many other them that platform, whatever, Epidaros or out of finally got one. But the 20s BC point of normalization, Spartans as such, playwrights, that sort of theatre as a marshalling gradually, not cultural or for performance, but not for the performance. Even this new theatre, more like or for cultural risk, or perhaps of plays or poems, but not comedies such as we're familiar with. So I've moved to Rome, and I'm having to go little bit faster now. Particularly good edited by Anton Powell that I meant. French scholar Yves Lafont translated Sparta in the Roman period. An event, and I'm really happy to pay tribute here. Within the Roman Sparta studies, since 2002, Yorgos Steinhauer, Julius Eurycles, Symvolikis Spartis, getting on for 1,000 pages Greek with English summary, came out in 1992. And it published new, and when we say new, we mean newly published, Greek inscriptions of Rome, Sparta, and Laconia. For that Sparta's becoming normal publishes things that have been inscripted.
Excuse me, Paul. Excuse me, Paul. Can I just interrupt? Can you just disconnect and reconnect? We're just having, I think there's a bit of a problem with the connection. You're breaking up. If you don't mind, sorry to intervene. You can just disconnect and reconnect. Yeah, because you're breaking up and you weren't legible.
Oh.
We will have Professor Cartledge back very soon in a few seconds, and we're noticing a few issues with his connection. And yes, and Professor Cartledge, maybe just take it back 3 or 4 minutes. You know what I mean? Yes. So don't be concerned about the time. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure how far back you'd like me to go, but I'll just, we're at
just a few minutes.
Okay, we're at the Hellenistic Roman now transition. I'm moving entirely to what we call Roman Sparta. And I started by signaling, by calling out, shouting out an article by Yves Lafont in the Powell Ed collection. But that takes second place to a publication from last year by Yorgos Steinhauer. Now, some of you will know him. He was for many years the curator, the director of the Perioeci Museum, and he's actually from the Perioeci, but you can probably guess from his name that he's originally, his family came over to Greece from Germany, from Bavaria, with King Otto in the 1820s and 30s. At any rate, he was my effort. So, but for Yorgos, I couldn't have done the research that I absolutely had to do in the Sparta Museum and in the territory of Laconia, on Kythera, among other places, but for Yorgos, who's a dear friend as well as a revered senior colleague. At any rate, he wrote a book called Gaios Julios Evryklis, Symvolistin Historia tis Romaikis Spartis. 2 volumes, nearly 1,000 pages, a raft of new Greek inscriptions showing that Sparta has joined, as it were, the normality of Greek communities who like publishing things. They write documents on stone or bronze and set them up in public places. Very little of that in classical Sparta now becomes quite insistent, together with a few new Latin inscriptions as well. So what I'm going to do very briefly is look at some highlights. I've just singled out 4, and I'll go through them rapidly, and then I will draw to a close by looking at Sparta in its final years, final centuries. So first we have the remnants of a large stone surface inscribed with communications, that is letters, petitions, subscripts, between Augustus and Sparta. Sparta under the rulership de facto of Gaius Julius Eurycles. Notice his name, which is of course Roman. So Spartans have started to become Roman citizens. They've started to take the full Roman form of nomenclature while retaining, of course, their original Greek name as a cognomen. That's the last of the three. So his Gentile name is Julius because it was thanks to Augustus that his family became Roman citizens. So Augustus is the first Roman emperor, circa 27 BC, BCE to AD or CE 14. He actually visited Sparta in 21 BC, and it's thought to be just about then that the theatre of which we see the remains when we visit Sparta was actually completed in the 20s BC under Eurycles. And Eurycles was a protege of Augustus. The way in which emperors liked to rule their empire was not by putting in garrisons of, as it were, Italian troops, but by having friendly local people who would rule for them in their name. And it's an old imperial technique. It was the technique used by the Persian Achaemenid Empire before the Greeks, before the Romans. So now we're talking about a Sparta which is deprived of its Perioeci and of its Helots. Just to remember that, we're now down to the city of Sparta and its immediate environs. The backstory, Eurycles and Augustus, is brilliantly told by Tony Sporforth in his Greece and the Augustan Cultural Revolution. That's a book that came out in 2012, and I've given a online link to that. There's another connection which is rather fascinating and unique. When the Roman world was convulsed by civil war in the late 30s, Augustus, not yet called Augustus, Octavian, versus Mark Antony, almost all the Greek east of the empire sided with Mark Antony, and the west, mainly Latin speaking, sided with Augustus, so from Italy, north and west. But Sparta took the side of Augustus, and actually Eurycles fought at the decisive battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Augustus's men, he wasn't there personally, defeated Antony's navy. And so why was Sparta so keen on the Romans as opposed to the Greeks? And the thought is that a very peculiar personal connection, namely Livia. Livia became Octavian Augustus's wife in the early 30s, in 38 BC, but a few years before she'd been fleeing for her life during the Civil War, and she'd fled to, among other places, Sparta, which had given her sanctuary. So there's a connection already before Augustus gets together in terms of marriage with Livia. At any rate, such was the respect, the affection, if you like, for the imperial family in this part of the Greek world, that a former Perioecic city, Githyon, Sparta's main port, actually paid cult to Livia as a goddess, identifying her as Tyche, the goddess of fortune. So that's the first. Secondly, an inscription set up by one of those I mentioned, patronomoi, an eponymous. His name was Aristocrates, son of Hipparchus. Now, what's important about this newly published inscription is that we can now with certainty both identify the date of this man, which is in the reign of Tiberius, AD 14 to 37, and identify him with this is going to be a surprise, a historian, a Spartan historian, because in the high classical period, no Spartans wrote history. in the Hellenistic period, some Spartans started to write sort of cultural history of festivals, things, but not what we call narrative history. Here we have a Spartan historian used by Plutarch. Third item. Now, this in a way is the most important. It's beyond me, if you see what I mean. It's above my pay grade. But this is what Tony was going to speak about this very week himself, Tony Sporforth. It's a stele inscribed with shouts or acclamations. And these are shout outs for individual Spartan young adolescents. So they're sort of 14 to 20. They're what the Greeks called ephebes. And they're taking part in a competition in which there is a single victor. So this isn't one of the team games the Spartans were famous for. This is an individual competition. And the first of these acclamations, there are at least 4, singles out Herodes, son of Hipparchus, victory. Now, we can fill out that name, Herodes being just his Greek name. He's Tiberius Claudius Atticus Herodes, and he's the son of Tiberius Claudius Hipparchus, son of a famous man, namely the one that in Athens I'm familiar with, Herodes Atticus, the theatre in is dedicated by, paid for. A lot of you will know this. He had an estate in the northeast Peloponnese, somewhere near Luku, the monastery of Luke. And there, for example, have been found an inscription which he removed from Athens about the Battle of Marathon and taken to his estate in the Peloponnese because he was himself from Marathon. So he's very proud of this. And that's quite recently been found and excavated. At any rate, this Tiberius Claudius was taking, Herodes, son of Hipparchus, was taking part in what the Greeks called the agone, the contest of carteria, endurance. And I'm going to come back to one very unpleasant aspect of that very shortly. What's extraordinary about this, in other words, for the history of Sparta, is that this man who shouted out, he's going to be a consul in Rome under Hadrian. This is 133 AD. It indicates how Sparta has become part of the wider culture. It's a kind of pseudo-military culture that the Romans are keen to promote and the Spartans are particularly keen to promote because, of course, actually, Greece is demilitarized. And so when Spartans bang on about how wonderfully military they are, what a terrific history they have, looking back, this is all myth history. And it's particularly well discussed by a Melbourne native. I couldn't resist mentioning her, a good friend of mine, Estelle Strasdin. She now teaches at the ANU in Canberra. And her book, Fashioning the Future in Roman Greece, came out just in February, so I strongly recommend that. 2 footnotes, and then I conclude. First footnote, middle of the 3rd century, we're moving on a century from the last item, Sparta was invaded in 267 by a bunch of people, a Germanic people called the Heruli. Our source is an Athenian historian, a man called Dexippus. And they possibly came, the heralds, originally from Scandinavia. They certainly arrived by sea at Githyon, which is the easiest point of access, of course, to Sparta. If you're coming by sea, it's just about 45 kilometers away from Sparta. And then I'm now moving right forward to the end game, the end of the 4th century, 396, Alaric and his Goths, again coming down from the north, they sacked Sparta. And that was, to all intents and purposes, the end of ancient Sparta, as opposed to medieval Byzantine or modern or contemporary Sparta. So Sparta, the place, cedes its priority, its preeminence to a nearby settlement, which wasn't settled until the 13th century. And this is, of course, Mistra, the ville à Douai, fortress capital of the despotate of the Morea. This is the second city in the Byzantine Greek Empire, second only to Istanbul, which is, of course, then Constantinople. So that's the end of Sparta. If we could perhaps have those slides of mosaics, Kostas, that would be absolutely wonderful if you could magic them onto the screen. Right, here we go. So when I was made an honorary citizen of Sparta, quite a long time ago now, in the early 2000s, I was given a number of things: a scroll, a fantastic slap-up meal outside, very Spartan, in the open air, I mean. And there was an accompanying conference, absolutely fantastic, where many international scholars, either British or Greek, who had worked at Sparta for any reason, including Yorgos Steinhauer, came and delivered speeches. I was also given a copy of this mosaic, which shows you Orpheus with his lyre charming the animals. So that tells you a rather different sort of Sparta. When you hear the word today, Spartan, you think austerity, you think tough, you think military. Yes and no. The Spartans were always very keen on musiki, using it in different ways: music, poetry, dancing, and so on. So this is not at all un-Spartan. You might think it is. Do we have the other mosaic, Kostas? We do. Now, sorry, this is not so clear, but my last book was on Thebes. How was Thebes founded? It's founded by Cadmos, and Cadmos was not a Greek. He came from Phoenicia, which is today Lebanon, and he had a sister. He was a prince. He had a sister called Evropi, Europa, and Zeus took a fancy to her, as Zeus's wandering eye tended to do. At any rate, he went to the great lengths of transforming himself into a bull, trotting over, or rather swimming over, to Tyre in Lebanon, Phoenicia, and, well, the polite term is abducting, but having his way with, raping, capturing. And so here you see a wonderful mosaic of Europa on the back of Zeus as a bull. And why is Europe called Europe? Because of her. And she's actually an Asiatic princess. So I thought that was a rather lovely point on which to end, a lighter moment after the darkness. If you have been listening, thank you so much.
Okay, of course, just one moment. Professor Cartledge, what can I say? Not that it wasn't to be expected. Thank you for another sort of excellent presentation, and I'm sure there'll be some questions from the audience. I think Miltiadis would like to just kickstart off the questioning. He asks, Miltiadis, do you want to pose the question yourself since you're with us?
Sure. Thanks again, Nick, for organising this, and thank you so much to the professor. How very lucky we are to have been at least in the digital presence of Professor Paul Cartledge, who is, for all of us, a living titan in the field. So my question, having listened to the seminar, is, do you see, Paul, parallels then between Hellenistic and Roman Sparta, which looked back to past glories, and the modern Greek state?
Oh, that's a really, well, it's both interesting, Miltiadis, but also quite a tough one. I believe someone not so long ago wrote an entire book about Greek collective perception of their present state in relation to some supposed ancestral past. And of course, as I said right at the beginning, when we look back to whether a golden age or just any past age, we're always selective. In other words, we have our current motivations, pressures, anxieties. And it's those that we seek to allay, or we seek to enhance by looking back to a particular choice of past. Now, when the new Greek state came into being, and I hope I stressed adequately, just how progressive. It wasn't merely revolting to independence, but actually wanted to set up a new kind of republic. But it was not allowed to do so by the so-called great powers of France and Britain and so on. Anyway, they took the decision in the 1830s, 1840s, needing some focus of identity. When you're new, and as such, you have no immediate tradition. You've had nearly 400 years of Turkish domination. How do you look back? To what do you look back? Well, if you're very religious, you see that the Orthodox Church played not just a key role under the Turks, in other words, preserving the notion of Hellenism at all, but also in the actual revolution. The famous Declaration of Independence, March the 21st, was by a bishop. And so that's one possible source of a usable past as a model. But because the new leaders of independent Greece, insofar as they were intellectual, were very often trained classicists, they preferred to look back beyond Byzantium, beyond Roman Greece, beyond Hellenistic Greece, which I've been talking about, to classical Greece. Why? Well, because in the 5th century, but also the 4th, but more particularly the 5th, Greeks achieved things which were so astonishing in intellectual terms, in aesthetic terms, that they hadn't been copied, they hadn't been imitated, they hadn't been measured up to anywhere since, not even by the Romans, who conquered Greece and then actually were the key conduit of Hellenism through to Byzantium, and so ultimately the Renaissance, and so ultimately to us. And so that was thought to be the best usable, iconic, and I mean that for once literally, image of what Greece at its best was. This had one unfortunate consequence, and I think that's what lies behind your question. What if modern Greeks cannot live up to Pericles, Sophocles, Hippocrates, you name it, those terrific Greek thinkers, aesthetic creators, etc., of the 5th century BC. And I believe quite recently a whole book was written to the effect that one problem of the, as it were, collective psyche of modern Greeks is precisely that choice. It was a big mistake to choose that, because no modern Greek state, no version of a modern Greek state could possibly live up to, at any rate, the imagery, the ideal imaginary past Greece. So yes, if you're living in Sparta in the 2nd, 3rd century BC, you are doing, when you're performing in a competition of strength, in a way that you claim to be sort of like your ancestors back in the 6th, 5th, 4th centuries really did, when they were really great. But now I didn't actually mention in the talk, there are two features of the recreation of ancient Sparta that are really telltale. One of them was the building of an amphitheatre in the sanctuary of Orthia. And this is in the 2nd century, the same sort of period that we're talking about with the Tiberius Claudius, blah, 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 Herodes Atticus. And it was an amphitheatre for tourists to come and watch a particular phenomenon, a particular ritual going on around the altar of Orthia, assimilated to Artemis since way back when. And the ritual was the ritual of flogging. And the word is preserved by a Roman period Greek source. It's diamastigosis. And in the real ancient Sparta, flogging was reserved for unfree or non-Spartan citizen people. So in other words, to flog a citizen was regarded as utterly demeaning. But there was one ritual, Xenophon is our source, whereby cheeses were piled up on the altar of Orthea. And they were guarded by young adults in their early 20s bearing whips. Spartan boys, 16, 17, 18, were required to brave the whips of the young men to get at the cheeses, and the one who stole or caught or retrieved the largest number was the winner. And so that was part of a religious ritual to do with nature, cheese, milk, and so on. Artemis Orthia is a goddess of nature, of reproduction, whatever. It had become degraded to a mere slogfest, or rather a flogfest, which Spartan, aged 16, 17, 18 in the 2nd century, could last longest without raising his hands and saying, I'm quitting. And some actually lasted long enough to be killed. In other words, they refused to give in, they refused to submit, but they actually died under the lash. Well, you know, that seems to me a rather sad simulacrum of what had once been a pretty strange, but nevertheless comprehensible and not lethal form of religious worship.
Professor Cartledge, before the start of this presentation, I had this idea in my mind, maybe at some future date, Professor Cartledge can come back and talk about Byzantine Sparta. But I lost all hope in that with the last comment on your handout. When the Goths sacked Sparta, Sparta was replaced by Mistra, and it wasn't resurrected until Greek independence. So basically, after 396, after the sacking of the Goths, you've got the period of late antiquity, Byzantine, Ottoman periods. Nothing really much happened. There was a period of sort of dormancy or something until the revolution. Is that true?
Completely right. And the irony, I mean, it's not an irony, but it's a rather unfortunate circumstance. When they decided in 1830 or so to rebuild Sparta, in other words, Mistra still existed, people still lived up there, but relatively few, and it had not been much of a thing since the 1450s or 1460s in political terms. When, in other words, Sparta was resurrected as an independent political entity, the capital of the nomos, the province of Greece, they built it plonk right on top of ancient Sparta, which is one of the reasons why it's actually very difficult to get at archaeologically what Sparta was like in, let's say, 7th, 6th, 5th centuries BC. We rely still heavily on written literary sources, whether textual narratives or whether inscriptions, rather than, as in Athens, in the Kerameikos, for example, you can excavate the entire site pretty well and get back to what it might have looked like in the 5th, 4th centuries BC. So yes, Sparta was just, yes, a space, and people lived there, but hardly any, and they were of no political consequence for many, many centuries.
Okay, I've got a question from, I presume, to Mr. Skinas. What is the relationship between the ancient Macedonians and Spartans, given both are Doric Greek tribes? Did the Highlanders, the ancient Macedonians, migrate north from the Peloponnese?
Right. This is, I'm sure a questioner is aware, somewhat of a sensitive issue, but I'll try to avoid political controversy. The Macedonian royal house was known as the Timenid royal house, and they claimed that the ancestor of their entire family, just as the Spartans claimed that Heracles was the ultimate ancestor of their family, well, they claimed that a man had gone from Argos, not Sparta, to up in the north, and this is before Pella becomes the capital. The first capital of the Macedonians was Ege, which is something to do with goats, and it's where Vergina is today, the wonderful tombs, which have been brilliantly excavated by Manolis Andronikos. And so there's no direct connection between Sparta and Macedonia, but there is between Argos and Macedon, and the connection is entirely as stated. It is through Heracles, and it is Dorian as opposed to Aeolian or Ionian, the other main branches of the Greek family, linguistically, culturally, religiously. But as I say, it's not actually from Sparta, but it is the same Heracles, it is the same Zeus. And so the Macedonians, when they coined, they too used Heracles as Arius, I mentioned, Arius the First used Heracles, an image of Heracles on their coinage.
Question from Steve Bacalus. In an accidental way, I became involved with the Sparta revival project. My question is, how can a modern Sparta build on its historical past, given some wrong perceptions that you highlighted?
Yes, well, this is a constant problem, isn't it? Historical purism. I'm a historian, so my entire life is dedicated to seeking out what I count as, what can be persuasively put forward as the truth, as opposed to myth or legend or sheer fiction, of which, of course, lots of ancient Greek memories were made. And in a way, myth, the Greek word myth, originally meant a tale, traditional tale, whether true or not, but one that was accepted. But as early as Herodotus, he uses the word mythos just twice, both in connection with Egypt in Book 2, though talking about Greeks, but in relation to Egypt, the Book 2 on Egypt. And in both cases, he uses it negatively. In other words, if you want to say, I am descended from Heracles, my name is Cleomenes I, I'm king of Sparta, and my descent is through X, Y, and Z, and that is a myth. Now, if you're Herodotus, you're trying to test the validity, the historical truthfulness of traditional tales, and all you have, by and large, is oral tradition. Well, Herodotus twice uses the word myth negatively to expose what he took to be demonstrably false tales. So that is what I call historiographical criticism. And Herodotus, that's one of the reasons he is my intellectual ancestor. So were you to want to project today a version of a modern Sparta that somehow incorporates elements of ancient Sparta, I, as a historian, might well disagree with, I might conflict with somebody who merely wants to use myth in the broad sense. I'll give you just one, it's the obvious example, Thermopylae. Thermopylae is the biggest myth, that's a both traditional tale and a tale with elements of untruth that the Spartans developed and that other Greeks developed further. And I'll give just one illustration, one example of what's typically got wrong. It's usually thought that all 300 of the Spartans that Leonidas specially recruited as his bodyguard for Thermopylae died at Thermopylae. They didn't. Now, how do I know that? Because I believe Herodotus, who specifically makes clear that 2 Spartans survived from Thermopylae to fight again, or in one case to get sued out of shame at having survived. Now, that's not quite such a great tale, is it? As Leonidas and his 300 all died at Thermopylae defending the freedom of Greece. It's just a small illustration.
Okay. I've got a question from Fotinik Leftoyanis. You mentioned King Epaminondas conquered Sparta. How does this fit in with the conquering of ancient Mycenae timeline? Did the takeover promote interaction between the 2 states?
Well, Mycenae this is again, we're in the territory of myth. Once the new city of Mycenae, the liberated city of Mycenae, was built, came into being in the 360s BC with fantastic walls around it 9 kilometers of walls. You go there today, Mount Ithome, it's most impressive. Sparta yet did not have a wall at all. And one reason for the new Messini building a wall was to make the point, we are not Sparta, we are independent. Well, these are the descendants of people who were claimed to have had once upon a time a city of Messini, which sadly the Spartans had conquered and suppressed. So it's a recreation, which is something like Agis and Cleomenes saying, we're not inventing the new social political reforms that we are putting forward to you, we're reinventing and so on. Probably in both cases completely fictitious. So Messini becomes an independent state in the 360s, and of course a major enemy of Sparta, because Sparta struggles for the first 50 years. Most of Sparta's attention, apart from to Thebes and other cities in further north and Argos and so on, but is trying to get back Messini, trying to get that territory back and to get those Helot workers back. Of course, the Messenians look everywhere they can, Macedon, Argos, Thebes, anywhere that will help them to resist the Spartans' attempt to take over. So the Spartans and the Messenians are not destined to get on terribly well. And when the civil wars, the Roman imperial civil wars of the 40s occur, I mean, they started in the 40s, they go on through the 30s into the early 20s. Guess which side Messini took? Well, of course, Mark Antony's. And guess, I've told you which side Sparta took, the Augustan side. So they're never going to be terrifically good neighbors, but they are a long way apart.
We might finish up with one final question. I think we've sort of tired enough. It's from Mikey. Just to probably summarize, it's a question about the origins of the Romans. Were the early descendants of the Romans from Troy?
Right. Well, thank you very much for that question, because it plays straight into that myth narrative that I've been trying to develop. The Romans, the Greeks thought Rome was a Greek city because Rome in Greek means strength. So they sort of patriotically, some Greek authors, when they're under Roman domination, said, oh yeah, but you know you're a Greek city originally. Well, actually it wasn't. It was a Latin city. That is, Latin was the language, and there was various cultural things that linked all Romans with all Latins. At any rate, they chose, and it's actually Augustus who made the biggest thing of it all, because he had a tame court poet called Virgil, and Virgil wrote a poem called the Aeneid, which was the Romans' answer to the Iliad and Odyssey of the Greeks. And Aeneid is named after its principal, well, he's not always a great hero, but at any rate, principal figure, that is Aeneas. Now, Aeneas turns up in Homer's Iliad because he is a Trojan and he flees from Troy, and he's therefore available. And the Romans appropriated him, saying he came to Italy with his family, his father and so on, and said that he was descended on his mother's side from a goddess. So that's all very convenient, isn't it? And that eventually he settles down in the plain of Latium, and Rome is founded, not by him, but by Romulus and Remus in a later generation. But for Aeneas, there would be no connection between Italy, Rome, and Troy. That's entirely manufactured. There was no actual, real connection between the two cities whenever you think the sack of Troy happened.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I think we need to bring proceedings to a close. Thank you once again. I don't have to say, Professor Cartledge, you've been wonderful as always. Best of luck with all your research and book writing, and we hope to have you back again in the near future as well. And also thank you for Miltiades Papadopoulos for filling in and also introducing our speaker tonight as well. Don't forget, next week's seminar is not on the standard Thursday evening because of Easter. It's on Tuesday night, 7 p.m. sometime. So hope to see you in next week's seminar with the Maria Efthimiou as well. Okay, bye everyone, and thanks for following us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.